Доброго дня усім. Вітаю в центрі.
Good late afternoon, everybody. I'm welcoming you in the Center for Urban History. My name is Taras Nazaruk, and I will be the moderator of today's event. Let me introduce our speaker, our lecturer. I'm going to switch into English, and the lecture is going to be in English. We have a simultaneous interpretation available if you would like to listen to the interpretation, so you are free to do so. Please grab a pair of headsets. After the presentation, we will have a discussion, so you can ask your questions both in Ukrainian and in English.
This is the moment where I switch to English to introduce our guest, our speaker for today for this lecture, Velmet. Velmet is a historian, researcher, associate professor at the University of Southern California, and visiting researcher at the University of Tartu. Today we are going to have a presentation or talk on the history of digitalization in Ukraine. We all know about the such project as Diia, Vulyk, Trembita, digital governance, and all this discussion about that, but also in our everyday practices we often use the results of the digitalization of governance in Ukraine over the last 10 years, and it basically has its own history already, and we're going to have a presentation by Ara on that topic, and also on the Estonian influences, Estonian connections to these processes over the last 10 years. But in general, Aro is also a historian of a modern Europe, also a historian of colonialism, and also science, technology, and medicine. His last book in 2020 was published called Pasteur's Empire, which is on the French colonial policy, history of French colonial policy through microbiology and medicine, which is another interesting topic to discuss. And then Aro also currently is, I guess you're finishing, or you already finished another book, which goes from different topics, which is more about the history of cybernetics and different computerization projects, automatization projects in the late Soviet Union. And this part, I mean, within this book, within this research project, is also the topic of Ukraine is included. It's not a book about Ukraine, but some of the topics of the history of digitalization of Ukraine is there. And basically, today's presentation will touch upon these topics, upon some of the fragments from that book. So we have a great opportunity to also hear about some of the results of this research before it even published. So we're happy about this occasion, and yeah, now we have a presentation for up to 50 minutes. Then there will be opportunity to discuss what we hear and ask questions to Aro about his research and his presentation. And we are really excited to hear what you are going to present to us. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. First of all, I just want to say that it's great to be back here. Every time I'm here, I'm falling more in love with Lviv and with the Center for Urban History. So thank you for inviting me. Thanks to Taras for actually motivating some of this research that I'm presenting here with the Internet Histories collection that he's editing with some colleagues. And thank you to all of the Sophias for your support, logistical and intellectual. So I'm really, really happy to be back here. In 2019, shortly after his surprise victory in Ukrainian elections, President Volodymyr Zelensky paid an official visit to Estonia to sign a joint statement pledging to develop digital governance in both countries. Developing digital governance was actually, as I'm sure you all know, a central part of Zelensky's electoral platform in the 2019 elections. If you look at his election manifesto, then I'm using a translation here, then it begins like this. Let me tell you about Ukraine of my dreams. Ukraine, where salutes fire at weddings and birthdays only. Ukraine, where it is possible to start up a business in an hour, to obtain a passport for travel abroad in 15 minutes, and to vote in elections in a second on the internet. So it's really up there with like just following, an end to the war and then voting online. The tech sector and digitization became, in Zelensky's platform, a symbol of his turn away from the old corrupt status quo and towards a new, Western, agile, transparent, and progressive Ukraine. This was expressed in a number of different ways. He campaigned with the help of his Kvartal 95 crowd of people associated with his entertainment company. That included people who were very savvy social media people, and also who embraced this kind of Silicon Valley startup kind of attitude, everything from the way they talked about the potential for digital government, but also to, straight down to the aesthetics of it, right? So if you look at Mikhail Fedorov, the Minister for Digital Transformation, he likes to roam around in a black t-shirt. That's kind of the business attire of Silicon Valley. Sorry, I'm just figuring out how to look at my notes. So the way that this agenda for digital governance was set out in Zelensky's campaign was extremely expansive. And in more than one way, it borrowed from Estonia's example from about 2 decades earlier, from the early 2000s. It wasn't just about starting up a business in an hour and voting in elections and kind of smooth public administration. He also made promises about using the internet principally to enable more direct forms of democracy, to have citizens participate more meaningfully in political processes, and to reduce corruption. In his phrase, again, one that echoes from the Estonian example, a computer does not accept bribes, right? So if you can do your public services online, then you don't have to worry about, who do I have to pay off to get this statement or this document a little bit faster than I would normally get it. Now what's interesting is that after Zelensky was elected, the ambition of digitization somewhat narrowed and really became focused on this area that experts in the field call digital governance, and in particular, the provision of digital services. And if you just look at, in terms of the effort, sort of man hours, funding, and so on and so forth, that went into this program of digitization after Zelensky's election, and a lot of it revolves around a particular form of digital infrastructure that's called Trembita. So that's, this is a sort of PR image of Trembita on the right, and then on the left is what this architecture actually looks like. Now, what Trembita is, for those of you who aren't familiar with the technicalities, and I'll try to sort of keep the technical part of this talk to a minimum, but I have to do a little bit of it. It is essentially an architecture for exchanging data between different state registries and databases. So the state keeps various different kinds of records on people, keeps birth dates, death certificates, property registries, social welfare information, right, tax information, medical records, and things like that. But these are kept generally in different containers. So they're held by different ministries, by different institutions. And one of the central challenges for any kind of public administration is that often you need to cross-reference different kinds of data. Yeah, so for instance, if somebody applies for a social welfare benefit, then that might be dependent on their health status, right? Are they, for instance, a veteran, or do they have some kind of chronic disease? It might be dependent on their income, so what is their tax return from the last year, say? It might be dependent on their marital status, right? Are they married? Are they a head of household? Are they a widow? So these are all things that the state has to cross-reference. In the olden days, this was done manually, so you had armies of bureaucrats running around archives, essentially, pulling out files. This can be done using mainframe computers and punch cards, which is, how the UK and the US did it in the 1960s. Trembita allows this to be done over the public internet. So essentially, it's an architecture that encrypts data from these various registries, checks and authenticates queries. So does the person who is submitting the query, do they actually have a right to query information, and then sends it to its destination where it is then decrypted, again checked for authentication, etc., etc. And all of this is done over the public internet, which is a particular feature, and particularly interesting feature of this architecture. You could also do this via, for instance, private networks, right? Leased lines where no other traffic goes except for the traffic that's related to public data. You can do this over virtual private networks. Loads of ways you could hack this technically, but Trembita uses the public internet for this purpose. And then, once you can do this, once you can automatically cross-reference public data from different registries, there's all kinds of things you can then do automatically. So all of these applications that I'm sure a lot of you are using on a daily basis, like Diia, like the eBaby service, and others, are running on Trembita's architecture. So Trembita is the thing that makes all of these things possible. But it is also notably a much smaller and much more contained understanding of what digital public infrastructure means than this sort of sweeping promise of everything from speeding up the starting of businesses to democratic participation through things like citizen assemblies or different kinds of online fora that might be used for debating legislation or for checking on what people are doing at the Verkhovna Rada or in municipal councils and things like that. So what I want to do in this talk is sort of proceed with two questions. First is, why did digitalization in Ukraine become equated with this particular architecture, with Trembita? And not just in the sense that why did it become equated with the provision of public services, but also this particular way of providing public services through an architecture that's based on the internet, that's decentralized, and that is based explicitly on an Estonian model, right? And has been built by Estonian consultants. And secondly, what can tracing the history of this architecture from its Estonian version, which is called the X-Road, to its Ukrainian version, and by looking at how the meaning and the politics of this architecture changes over time as it moves from Estonia to Ukraine, what can that tell us about the pan-European politics of digital public infrastructure? Because I want to suggest that this tells us something about, in particular, how private-public partnerships, international development, and geopolitics interact with each other to produce this particular version of Trembita. So there are two concepts that I want to explore by tracing this history. that are relevant to our conversation here. And the first one is this idea of Trembita as a particular kind of flexible, multi-purpose infrastructure. And I think that's the only way we can understand why this infrastructure emerged in the form that it did, and why it's been so easy to reinterpret this over the course of 20 years in terms of the political work and the political meaning that it has for different constituencies. The thing about Trembita is, as is the case with a lot of information technology, is that it can be put to work for many different uses. It's something that can be, in particular, have both public and private purposes. So even though it's developed to facilitate the exchange of data between public actors, many of its features, in particular, the feature of secure authentication, is actually extremely useful infrastructure for private actors as well, and I'll come back to this. And then the second concept I want to explore here is the private capture of public value. I think in these kinds of situations, it's very important to think about who is, what is the political economy of these kinds of developments? Who is funding these things, and who is benefiting from the use of this kind of infrastructure? So in other words, who's paying for the costs of developing it, and who's making the profits from actually using it? And this is a story where I think, and I haven't quite, untangled this, and I don't pretend to have a final answer to this question, but I think it is very interesting that we see in this story a lot of instances where the costs of development of this infrastructure are borne by various kinds of public institutions, ranging from states to international development organizations, whereas private companies who are involved in building and running this infrastructure are also making quite serious profits. So this is sort of where we're going with this talk, and hopefully this will make somewhat more sense once we get to the end in the next half hour. So let's now go back to Trembita, or rather its version from 2001, which is called the X-Road. So you can see even the design of the Estonian sort of infographic is quite similar to the infographic used for Trembita. So this essentially serves exactly the same function in Estonia as it does in Ukraine. It links up different public registries, which include but are not limited to the population registry, the land registry, the registry of state assets, the registry of forests, registry of trademarks, registry of industrial design, criminal records registry, weapons registry, cancer registry, registry of pesticides, social welfare registry, dosage registry of radiation workers, a registry of registries, and many others. The promise of the X-Road turns on security, efficiency, and transparency. So security, this is data that moves across the public internet. So there's a real question of, well, how do we know that this does not fall into the hands of malicious actors? So the X-Road provides the encryption and the authentication tools to make sure that only people who are authorized to see this data. And very importantly, the security argument or the security claim that the developers of X-Road are making is very directly oriented towards outside malicious actors. So this is really about, how do we ensure that hackers, foreign states, anybody else who's not supposed to see this doesn't hack into this. X-Road people have a lot less to say about questions of when the call is coming from inside the house. In a sense, the authentication part of this is supposed to prevent unauthorized people from accessing, but as we will see in the story, that's not exactly how things play out in practice. Efficiency is the second big claim. One of the reasons why the X-Road is supposed to be the best way of doing public data exchange is that it's very cheap, because precisely it doesn't require, for instance, leasing exclusive data communications from a phone company, right? It runs on the same data cables as everything else does. So it doesn't require sort of bulky, out-of-the-box corporate solutions that are often offered by big database companies like Oracle. So you don't have to hook yourself to a transnational company that you'll pay through the nose for the rest of your life. The initial version of the X-Road is open source. The version that Ukraine uses, Trembita, is based on a commercialized version called UXP, and we'll sort of talk about this. And it's not, well, it's quite crucial to the story, but we'll come back to this. And transparency. So, for instance, if you're, because again of this authentication function, if you want to know who's queried your data, you can go and check. You can see everybody who has made a query about your personal data for whatever reason. So it's a way of, this is the corruption reduction claim, essentially, right? So briefly, how did this X-Road come about in late 1990s, early 2000s Estonia? I go into this story in much more detail in the book that I'm about to finish, but I'll do a very rough and tumble sketch of this for the moment, because I think it's important to know, precisely to understand how much the political meaning and the purposes for which the X-Road is used has changed over time. I would say that there are basically three sources that lead to the development of the X-Road, and the first of them originates from Ukraine. So this is Viktor Glushkov, the head of the Kiev Institute of Cybernetics, in a lot of ways the sort of grand old man of Soviet cybernetics, and particularly known for his plan to build an all-union automated control system for the collection of statistics about the Soviet economy, in particular Soviet industrial production, and then for the management of this industrial economy, right? So Glushkov's idea was essentially that if the problem with the Soviet economy is the difficulty of planning, centrally planning an economy that's the size of 1/6 of the world, then computers offer precisely the way to do it. So if you could link up all of Soviet industry into a unified computer network that would transmit real-time data about inputs and production and outputs to, well, essentially to Gosplan, then Gosplan in turn would be able to plan for, you know, how much demand is there going to be in the next 5-year plan, for instance, right? So Glushkov planned to do this at an all-union level. There's an entire book written about how he failed to do this. This is Ben Peters, How Not to Network a Nation. But this idea really didn't die, it just got scaled down. And it got scaled down into the level of the constituent republics. So even as it became evident that Olgas, that's the name of the big network, was not going to materialize, different constituent republics continued to work on this idea, well, maybe we can link up the industrial production at the level of Ukraine, Estonia, Armenia, Moldova, Lithuania, and so on and so forth. So quite a lot of expertise and time was put into developing what this national network would look like. These ideas transformed quite a bit over the course of the 1970s and 1980s. And principally, they moved from being kind of laser focused on industrial production to being more broadly focused on the collection of social statistics as well. So demographic data, health data, so on and so forth. And they went from being oriented around a kind of centralized factory model to being thought of as more decentralized, which in large part had to do with changes in the availability of information technology, basically. This is happening as we're moving from the era of mainframes that are like 3 times the size of this room to microcomputers that you can put on your desk. So what we're seeing here is an automated control system built for the Olympic regatta held in Tallinn in 1980. And as you can see, this is already being done on what are essentially, I think, Apple II clones. So this is the point where it is really becoming possible to actually imagine something like this happening on a decentralized level. So in Estonia, the engineers who are coming up with this plan, as Estonia transitions from being a Soviet republic into an independent state, they end up working for, by and large, either for private companies or from the state chancellor. And they are the ones who take up this idea and really kind of give it new life in the 1990s. So this is one source. The other source has to do with the practicalities in the Estonian civil service of having to build up a completely new state that functions in a market economy in record time in the middle of a giant financial crisis with an eye towards joining the European Union, and, which ended up happening in 2004. And it becomes very quickly very evident that continuing the same database practices that were in use in the Soviet period is simply not tenable. One, because the volume of work is just that much greater. And 2, because the kind of work that has to be done on databases is also a different quality. So now, in a market society, you need things like a business registry. You need to calculate value-added tax. These are things that they just happen differently from this kind of vertical model, ministry-based model, where you report things to your superiors, and your superiors report them to their superiors, and then in the middle of all of this, they fudge the numbers so that they show you in the most pleasant possible light. You can't really do this in a situation where you don't even know who the businesses are, right? You first have to have a registry of businesses in order to find that out. So a lot of this work on networking different databases really begins through the civil service and begins super informally, and is done initially with no concern whatsoever to things like privacy or data security. It's literally people sending Excel files across the public internet in email attachments, or at best through FTPs or intranet if that's available. In particular, if those particular institutions happen to be linked into the same local area network. But it's done super ad hoc. And a part of what's happening is that these guys on the previous slide who were interested in developing these automated control systems see this and say, look, this has to stop. This is not sustainable. So seeing these practices happening on the ground, they come in and say, okay, what is it that we can do with the resources that we have? So we have the public internet, we have these ad hoc databases that are in existence. Well, let's see if we can figure out a way to make the system more secure. And this is where we get the part of the X-row that's about encrypting data and so on. Now, the third community that's really interested in all of this are banks and telecommunications companies, who at the same time as the Estonian government is figuring out its data exchange or starting to offer online services for their clients. So this is the era of the first iBanking, right? So instead of going to a brick and mortar shop, a bank branch, why don't you just log in through your personal computer? There are very few of them around at this point, but more of them are coming, and the banks are smelling that this could be really a market, and of course the people who tend to have PCs are wealthier, and the banks want to get in on that. And and they see that at a certain point this might enable them to shut down some of these branches in small communities that have maybe 20, 30 customers and things like that. But it's actually quite hard to do, because with banking, you really want to make sure that you are who you say you are. It's not like the New Yorker cartoon where anybody can, any dog can say that they're a human, right? You really need to make sure that if you're transferring money or if you're accessing your bank account, you're actually the person who has the right to access this bank account. So the banks and the telecommunications companies are really interested in secure, reliable authentication. And Estonian banks don't have the R&D capital to actually build something like that. So this is the point where Estonia's banks are being gobbled up by Scandinavian banks. So this Hansabank becomes Swedbank, the Swedish banking giant. And in Sweden, you can do things like sell a PIN calculator for that costs about $40 or $50 to a bank customer. But in Estonia in 1997, $50 is about the average monthly salary. So you can't do that. That's not an option. So what do the banks do? The banks figure out that the state is at work creating this public data exchange, and that a part of this has to do with developing secure authentication. So they say to the state, okay, well, why don't we pitch in on this? And you guys put up the money for building out this infrastructure, and we'll help with the kind of day-to-day practice of actually running it. So if you need, for instance, server space that needs to be online all the time, that's kind of certification authority that helps check whether the correct person is logging in, then we'll manage that. But you bear the initial research and development costs. And the Estonian government says yes. And indeed, this is the reason why out of actually quite a few different programs that have to do with developing public digital infrastructure in the 1990s, the X-Road is the one that really takes off, because it has this buy-in from the private sector as well. It's flexible infrastructure. Right? It does something for the state, but it does equally as much for private companies. But the state ends up being the one who carries the majority of the financial burden of actually putting this up. And then also does this little thing where the authentication tool, which is the Estonian ID card, is made compulsory for the entire population. So one of these huge questions that the banks have, which is, who's going to go through the trouble of you need to go to the bank branch, you need to get a PIN calculator, you need to not lose it, is immediately solved. Now everybody's a potential bank customer because they already have the authentication tool in their purse. Okay, so the security thing they really miss initially. These guys are thinking about cryptography, but they're not thinking about it particularly hard. But in the late 1990s, this CD starts circulating in one of the secondhand markets in the suburbs of Tallinn. And if you buy this CD, you can find a whole lot of data about most everybody. So everything ranging from their home address to their criminal history, like how many traffic tickets they've gotten, or if they've been imprisoned, or something like that. And this becomes a thing where, for instance, enterprising journalists buy this and write stories off of this. So they query this minister or that CEO and see let's see what's interesting on that CD about them. And there's in fact a story in Estonian public broadcasting where they show, this is how you put the CD in, this is how you find out where the prime minister lives. So this becomes a real problem and becomes very apparent that something needs to be done around these kinds of security breaches. So this leads to the development of stronger cryptography and beefing up of these authentication rules. So in particular, the rule that the system really checks whether the person querying a database actually has the right to have information from that database, and then that they'll only have access to the part of the database that they are authorized to have access to, not the entire thing. But importantly, this is entirely oriented around the language of a lone hacker, breaching into the system unauthorized and hoovering up things. And really the thing that the X-Road initially revolves around is this is an efficient tool for the civil service to do their job well and quickly and with just really cost efficiently. It doesn't cost as much as buying this technology from Oracle. Now this all changes in 2007. And the reason this changes is because Estonia ends up embroiled in major protests in the spring of 2007. So I'm not going to narrate this whole story, but basically what this revolves around is a politically charged conflict that is further inflamed by different political factions that revolves around this World War II memorial that was located in the center city of Tallinn. And this is a Red Army soldier. These are super common, as you all know. And it's a monument put up in sort of the middle of the Soviet occupation in the 1960s as a commemoration to those who've fallen in the Great Patriotic War. And for the minority Russian-speaking population, this is an important gathering place for commemorating their families who suffered in the war on the 8th of May. Now for the Estonian-speaking community, the 8th of May is not the end of the war necessarily. I mean, it is the end of the war, but it is also the start of 40 years of Soviet occupation. So the emotions associated with having a Red Army soldier in the middle of the city are quite different. And in 2007, the right-wing liberal government makes a campaign promise to remove this Alyosha from the center of town, and they win, and then in the middle of the night, they come in with a crane and remove it, and this just explodes, right? It leads to 2 days of protests in Tallinn. There's a lot of damage to property. There's a couple of people who get killed. There's a tremendous amount of police violence. And importantly, this is accompanied by massive attacks on Estonian digital infrastructure that are coming primarily from Russia and that are using this sort of very basic but extremely effective thing called a distributed denial of service attack. So I'm seeing lots of nods, lots of you know what this is. What it basically is flooding a particular server with meaningless requests, right? So instead of saying to the population registry, when was Taras Nazaruk born, you just send 7,000 queries that say, whoa, and the server has to process them, right? Like it has to figure out whether one of them is actually asking for Taras's birthday. And as a result, the server gets overburdened and legitimate queries don't come through. Estonia assembles a team of cybersecurity experts. They work with NATO partners, they work with international partners. They essentially end up having to seal off the Estonian internet for a couple of days from the global internet just to like track down sources of these attacks. But importantly, while the source of these attacks was never definitively identified, Estonian officials and Western cybersecurity experts increasingly started these linking to, quote, organized Russian cyber criminal groups, which is most likely exactly what they were, and later claiming that they were, if not condoned, that they were at least condoned by the Kremlin, if not actively coordinated by its leaders, so suggesting that this was really a state-led attack against Estonian infrastructure. A decade and a half later, it is not uncommon to see in scholarship this event being referred as the first instance of a, quote, coordinated cyber attack against a nation state. So, in this light, Estonian officials and cybersecurity experts start talking about the X-Road in a markedly different way. It now, when you look at the literature on the X-Road and the way that this is being presented to the international audience, it is not so much a quick and efficient way to simplify the life of civil servants trying to put this data together. It is promoted as the reason why Estonia was so able to be resilient in these cyber attacks. It is because of its distributed and decentralized architecture. So there isn't a single point of failure. There isn't a central server that handles all the queries between the different databases that you can knock out and then render the entire system dysfunctional or inoperable. Or even worse, it's not a single database where all the information is located, so you can, if you break in through the front door, then you can just hoover up everything you get, No, you break into one database, all you get is that one database. And again, of course, this is, in a lot of ways, this is completely correct. This is flexible infrastructure. It helps civil servants do their jobs, but it also, as it turns out, is fairly reliable protection against things like foreign cyber attacks and cyber warfare. The other thing that happens in these following years is that the Estonian market for digital transformation is starting to become quite saturated. There's a lot of companies in that field. A lot of the sort of lower hanging branches have been picked. And so companies that have been at work on things like X-Road start looking abroad. And this is now quite the complicated process. So I'll illustrate it with two examples. The first is the case of Cybernetica LLC. This is the company who originally, as a public entity originally, as the Institute of Cybernetics near the Tallinn Institute of Technology, developed the architecture for the X-Road in the early 2000s. But the X-Road was developed as open source. It was developed with public funds, so open source development was a key criteria for this. The code is freely available, anybody can use it, so what do you do? Well, what the good people at Cybernetica did was they took the X-Road as a basis for developing their own proprietary architecture. So they continued developing and adding bits to it that would make the architecture different enough from the X-Road that you could actually license it as separate software. And basically what they did was they made it more modular, and so that you don't have to take the whole thing, the whole architecture. You can pick and choose parts of it that you want. And they added some new architectural elements that made it more easily scalable. They fiddled around with the authentication procedures, but mostly they made this product standardized. So, and complemented it with their own consulting service that made it essentially a kind of plug-and-play system. So if a state or a company was interested in this now commercialized product, they could just call up the people at Cybernetica LLC, and they would go and they would put the architecture in place, say, okay, which bits do you want? And teach the various civil servants how to, and local IT experts how to use it. So this is one of these moments where two developments that at the end of the day are sort of fairly firmly in the realm of public-facing work, the initial development of X-Road to begin with, and then this major geopolitical incident, feed into Cybernetica LLC in a way that really enables them to capitalize on this public work that they've done in the past. Because now, when they're selling UXP, which is the commercialized version of Xroad, they're no longer selling the simplest, most cost-efficient way to exchange public services. They're serving this is your weapon against Russian cyber attacks to the world. So it still is not that easy to sell. I will say there's quite a few different products out there in the world that are offering this kind of service. So in order to facilitate with that, a couple of entrepreneurial guys who were involved with various kinds of digital projects in early 2000s Estonia start this thing called the e-Governance Academy, which is essentially a international consulting firm whose goal is to introduce Estonia's best practices to the world. And in the process, convince them that the best practices include purchasing UXP from Cybernetica and other services from other Estonian providers. So here's a picture from an e-Governance Academy presentation being made to the Ukrainian Ministry of Social Welfare. I think this is last year or maybe 2 years ago. And what's interesting about this to me is that if you're looking at the various sponsors in the background, then this tells you a lot about where the money for developing this public infrastructure is coming from. And the answer is it's coming basically from international development agencies. So there's Sweden, Sverige is in large numbers. The Swedish International Development Agency, SIDA, is one of the largest contributors to digital public infrastructure development around the world, but particularly in Ukraine. There's DT for UA, Digital Transformation for Ukraine, which is a European Commission funded project, also hundreds of millions of euros being poured into building this kind of infrastructure. Like MasterCard, yeah, sure, there are like private partners as well, but also then organizations such as UNICEF, USAID, back when there was a USAID, and other international development agencies are financing a lot of this. And in fact, the e-Governance Academy, their funding for this consulting work comes primarily from international development, so from various kinds of public funds being raised for international development. But really what they're doing is they're selling the products of these private Estonian companies. Okay, so how do we get from this to this being selected, to the Xroad being selected as the architecture to be used in Ukraine? Because I think this kind of illustrates the dynamic of how this kind of turning of public funds into private profit operates in practice. And really this story doesn't begin with Vladimir Zelensky, it really begins with Petro Poroshenko. And in fact, begins with Vladimir Groisman, who was the mayor of Vinnytsia before he ended up working for Poroshenko's government, and who started the first international development projects for developing digital public infrastructure, which were consulted by the e-Governance Academy at around 2014. And these begin with the establishment of these public administration buildings called Vulyk. So I'm assuming I don't have to explain what Vulyk is. I do? Okay, so I'll explain this. It's basically a kind of brick and mortar version of this kind of digital data exchange. So instead of doing, whatever public services you want to receive from social welfare to your driver's license, instead of it doing from your computer, you go to an office that's a kind of all-purpose administrative office for all kinds of data services. And the person who's behind the counter at that office can then use the X road to query whatever database they need to put together this information that they need about you to then issue you a driver's license or give you your old age pension or whatever. So it's not you can't do it online yourself, but you can go to a person at an office who does it online. And the reason, so this becomes first Volodymyr Groisman's big sort of claim to fame when he's the mayor of Vinnytsia, and then later Poroshenko sort of rolls this out on a more large-scale fashion across Ukraine. And the developers, I talked to some of the developers who worked on this project, and one of them described the logic of this whole thing as follows. So there's this old story about how statues of Lenin were built during the Soviet period. They would say to the authorities, look, we've got this nice park, but it doesn't have a statue of Lenin in the middle. So of course we have to have a statue of Lenin. But if we're going to put up a statue of Lenin, then, you know, this park looks like shit. We can't put a nice statue of Lenin in the middle of a crappy park like that. So then you have to, you know, do the mow the lawn and fix up the benches and so on and so forth. So the statue of Lenin is a pretext for doing something else. And so the way this developer framed it to me was that, well, Vulyk is the statue of Lenin, right? It's a thing that Poroshenko can point to and say, look, I made this, right? Like, here's an opportunity for me to cut a ribbon to show that I've done the good work for the people and move on. But really, for the developer and for, you know, other people working on these projects, Vulyk was just a pretext for getting the X road off the ground. That was what they were interested in. That was what organizations who were funding this were interested in. This was what SIPA was interested in. This was what the European Commission was interested in. It was really sort of for different reasons, some for cybersecurity reasons, some for anti-corruption reasons. Just let's make this thing more efficient. Let's try to reduce corruption in Ukraine. And if this has to come with a sort of nice little cute small building that you can then open, then, you know, so be it. But what's interesting in this story is, okay, so how did they land on this particular architecture? Because the Estonian e-governance academy was there just to consult. It wasn't clear that they were going to choose X road as the solution, right? There's many different options. So one of the things that EGA recommended was, well, you should do a comparative analysis of different architectural solutions. And the two ones, they looked at 6 or 8 different ones and then ultimately did a kind of deep dive into 2 different architectural solutions for data exchange. So here you're sort of seeing what this analysis looks like. One was Estonia's X road, and then the other one was a centralized solution used in Moldova called WSO2. So WSO2, again, I'm going to spare you the technical details, used a centralized enterprise service bus model, and importantly was really made for corporations, not for states. So this meant that architecture was built with a lot of assumptions in mind. So assumptions such as that we're talking about managing a large organization where more or less the databases are located kind of in the same place. In places where you would need a lot of additional services, you would have to do a lot of processing of data. You would have to, you know, constantly be feeding data up to the CEO or the CIO. You would have to have these minute details and exactly, you know, what your key performance indicators are. And that's not really what the state is interested in. The state is not interested in having a real-time overview of, you know, how much sales you're making in this or that area. They're interested in, you know, quarterly statistics. They're interested in, you know, when you're querying something, you actually get the information. the WSO was made for a completely different purpose. So it shouldn't be entirely surprising that if your consultant tells them to compare a thing that's made exactly for the thing you want to use it for, and then to use architecture made for a completely different purpose, then the one that's made for the thing you want to use it for comes out on top. So the neutral, disinterested consulting firm EGA comes in and says, well, we compare different options, and it just happens that according to the metrics we put in place to do the thing that you want, X-Road is the best. So Ukraine goes, this gets written into the white paper of Ukrainian digital development that's written around the mid-2010s, so during Poroshenko's time. And the Ministry of Digital Transformation, once it comes into being, has been following that white paper, that white book, ever since. So this is the other interesting thing about this story, is that Zelensky in his campaign portrays himself as essentially anti-Poroshenko. Right? It's like the previous, this is like typical for all campaigns, and I think maybe Ukrainian electoral campaigns in particular, but the previous government has really messed up. They promised to do away with corruption. They haven't done it. They've been just as corrupt, if not more corrupt, despite of the promises for this turn towards the West. But we're really going to do things differently. We're going to kick out the goons. But when it comes to digital transformation, he essentially just accelerates the same program that Poroshenko has been putting into effect for about 5 years. And indeed, a lot of the acceleration of Zelensky's, or maybe we should say Fedorov's, program of digital transformation has less to do with the way that the government is prioritizing it, and has more to do with the fact that in 2022, Ukraine starts receiving a lot more international development funds, because the outbreak of the full-scale war really opens up, in particular, the coffers of the European Union for all this kind of development. And so if you're looking at what does the budget of the Ministry of Digital Transformation actually look like, then it's predominantly international development aid. Very little of the infrastructural work, which by the way is the same story in Estonia, is being done using the actual tax money that's being collected from Ukrainian citizens. Is being done using foreign aid. And this foreign aid, where does it go? It often goes to back to and again, this is not a new story for foreign aid. This is a pretty old story for foreign aid. It goes back to the companies from the same European Union that's giving out this money. So the European Commission is giving money to Ukraine to develop its digital sector, and Ukraine gives it to Estonian consultants and Estonian engineers, who then build up Trembita as this particular kind of infrastructure. So if we look at what does the income stream of, let's say, the e-governance academy look like over the course of the past 5 years, then it looks like this. They're getting money from Moldova, Kyrgyzstan, Benin, like all these different places where they have projects, and then the vast majority of their income comes from Ukraine, which is a different way of saying it comes from SIPA, and it comes from the European Commission, and it comes from USAID. So this now takes me to this last point of the way in which this relationship between international development agencies, Ukraine, and these Estonian consulting firms is used by these consulting firms to leverage new value. So one of the problems with the X-Road is that you always get this comment if you're trying to sell it abroad, which is that, well, okay, this is all fine, but Estonia is 1.4 million people. So it's the size of a medium-sized multinational organization in terms of the amount of data that's being processed on a daily basis. So that, sure, you know, for Malta and, you know, I don't know, for Benin, for some island on the Caribbean, that's fine, but for Brazil, for Thailand, for Malaysia, for Bangladesh, these are giant countries. So how do we know that this architecture is actually going to work? So one of the things this Ukrainian project has allowed these companies like Cybernetic to do is to say, look, it works in Ukraine. Ukraine is a country of 40 million people. So if it works in Ukraine, it will work in Malaysia, in Brazil, and in these other places. And in fact, you see, Estonia has been quite successful at exporting this particular architecture all around the world into places that now do include very large countries such as Brazil, Argentina, Vietnam, Malaysia, and others, Costa Rica, so on and so forth. So the other way in which this collaboration is providing value to these private enterprises is by sort of providing a proof of concept that this can actually be, that they can actually do this on a large scale. So what do we take away from this entire story? A couple of different things. First of all is this relationship between infrastructural flexibility and the relationship between private and public value that's being moved around in this story. Because the way I'm seeing this story, you know, there's a couple of different ways to narrate it. Of course, the way that the Estonian state and these companies narrate it is as this excellent model of a public-private partnership. And certainly I think that there's a lot of truth to this in that, you know, obviously it's not a useless tool for the public. The public is clearly getting a lot of value by having its data siloed off, relatively secure against outside attacks and so on and so forth. But I think the part of the story that doesn't get told is the tremendous degree through which these companies profit very directly off of these various public investments that are being made and that are then sort of shown as kind of irrelevant to this whole story. So nobody particularly talks about the role that international development aid, for instance, plays in enabling these consultancies to do their work in the first place, or the relationship that the e-governance academy has to, you know, not being this really a neutral arbiter of best practices, but really being a sort of promotional arm of these products that were developed by public funds in Estonia but have now been privatized. Secondly, it shows us the way that geopolitics changes the narratives around these events and becomes an important player in this, in the internationalization and export of these tools, right? So without the cyber attacks on Estonian infrastructure in 2007, without the Estonian government's very intense lobbying to become a hub of cybersecurity, so it hosts for instance, NATO Cyber Security Center. There it really isn't a market for the X-Road. It's hard to overstate the degree to which it has been promoted as a tool that you want in the era of cyber warfare. And then the third part, which I really haven't spent as much time on here today, but I think that's worth considering, is asking this question of what ends up not happening, or what are the kinds of aspects of digital public infrastructure that get overlooked because so much of digitization, for instance, in the case of Ukraine, it gets boiled down into this public service, into this service provision component that can get this international development money for the construction of something like the X-Road. And one thing that I sort of gesture towards is this component of digital democracy, questions that revolve around Not so much service provision where, you know, I'm a client and the state is a service provider, but around a sharing of power and accountability, you know, so citizens' assemblies, other forms of political participation through online tools. So these tend to get crowded out by this very successful hyper-focus on service provision that Estonia has been promoting throughout the past 20 years. But also issues I think that we're in the United States are becoming hyper-aware of, such as security within the system architecture itself. Right, so historically, Estonian X-Road developers have been thinking very hard about how to make these systems secure against outside attackers. And they've been paying relatively little attention to exactly what are the politics of the people who are actually ordering this architecture, which leads to things like Estonia selling the X-Road architecture to countries such as Qatar, not exactly world champion in privacy regulations, and Kazakhstan and other authoritarian countries. And then I've tried asking some of them, well, how do you deal with the fact that you're essentially helping an authoritarian government link up its databases? And they've always kind of punted the answer. Like a typical answer that I've gotten is something along the lines, well, Stalin didn't need the X-Road to persecute you know, Soviet citizens. And it's like, yeah, but he would have loved it though. So I think, you know, from my parochial American perspective, as we're now seeing Doge sort of trawl around these different fairly siloed off databases in the United States and just kind of hoovering this thing up. And we're seeing how they're running into serious issues with doing that because the databases are using incompatible standards. They're often, you know, they're programmed in Fortran or some other sort of fairly outdated programming language. They're having a really hard time with it. And so I'm kind of left wondering, well, if the US used X-Road, all they'd have to do is change a couple of settings on the X-Road architecture, give you know, the Doge brothers permission to access everything, and you're off to the races. So, you know, this argument that, okay, well, these databases are decentralized and distributed works as long as you're thinking about, you know, evil Russians coming in and breaking into the bank and not running off with the entire thing. But if you're thinking about, well, what happens if the internal government changes? Then the answer is a lot more complicated, and this is a part of the story that's entirely not told in this kind of PR narrative of the X-Road. So, you know, lots of things to continue to think about, but I'll stop here, and I'm very happy to take questions and discuss this more.
Thank you very much, Aro, for this story. Very, very excellent story, and the way how you made this also historical loop, starting from Vulyk and from things that were discussed and happened in Ukraine, Kyiv, and then to Estonia, and then back to Ukraine. So very nice and very interesting to follow this narrative this way, especially because unlike, for instance, Ben Peters with his book does, this loop that you make and the story that you develop here does not include Moscow at all in this case. When it comes to the late Soviet period, when it comes to the period of transformation, basically you tell the story how this exchange and influences are happening in this decentralized, as you say, networks within the another node that is usually presented in the historical narratives about the region, about the even computer networks and history of computerization and digitalization. So potentially it's also interesting to hear your comment on that. How do you think about that, whether it was on purpose? How do you in general feel about that you basically make the story developing without Moscow in the focus, in the center of it? But in general, I wanted to, before I pass over the mic to the audience, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand, and we will give you a mic to ask your questions as well. But I would like to also ask another question related to the to this cybernetic element, so a cybernetics element that you bring in to this story, because you mentioned the Vulyk project, and you also mentioned how the Cybernetica as a private partner in this project, private company, developed from the Institute of Cybernetics in Tallinn. And I'm curious about this Soviet period, Soviet aspect of this story, because you also mentioned this quote. I believe it was from Zelensky or someone from Ukrainian team who develops this digital governance projects over the last years. Computer does not take bribes. Yeah. So this is a perfectly working metaphor that allows people to envision some bright future where computers allow you to overcome some issues with the economy and some, I don't know, corruption in society and so on. And this, I hear this similar things, similar stories a lot in, you mentioned Vulyk, and in what Vulyk says about the Haas and what the whole, this circle of cybernetics in the late Soviet period tells about the need for the computers, automated management systems, and so on. They say that the computer does not lie, basically, and you basically can have a real information about the products that were produced in the factory, and then you have an actual information about that, and you can plan future development and plan economy according to real numbers, because computer wouldn't lie to you, and you cannot trick out some data from the computer. And this is a narrative that happens a lot for that period. But I'm also curious, and maybe you have some thoughts about that. Where does it come from, actually? Because whether is it something that comes from, let's say, Soviet legacy, Soviet heritage, Soviet legacy, computer legacy, and kind of economy legacy, and cultural legacy that we have in Ukraine and in Estonia, and we think about computers that doesn't take bribes as something that I don't know, was discussed in this cybernetic discourse in late Soviet period, or is it more kind of common universal idea of this kind of techno-utopia that happens broader beyond this very specific context of Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and its general understanding how technology works, that it makes us better, and our society closer to this utopian vision of without bribes and without lying and so on. So maybe you have some comments on that.
Yeah. So I'll take your two questions and answer them in reverse order. So the interesting thing about Vulyk is he kind of changes his mind in the later phases of his life. So, you know, he writes this book called Cybernetics and Society, where he addresses precisely this, and he kind of says, look, like we think, and he sort of talks about the failure of August in part, and he talks about, you know, this example of, I forget where, like there's somewhere in Central Asia, they like build a big automated control system for managing the distribution of water between different collective farms, right? There's this huge problem, right? There's a limited amount of water to go around. How do you send it to different collective farms? And he's, you know, sort of like, let's do it rationally. Let's have the computer calculate the optimal distribution of water, and then, you know, nobody uses those calculations. Like, they run the calculations, but nobody actually, and then Vulyk kind of reflects on this and is like, well, yeah, of course, because there are so many variables that go into these kinds of decisions that we cannot put into an algorithm, right? So this thing that we call corruption actually, in a certain way, makes sense, right? It's different directors who are thinking about, you know, social relationships and like management of pride and all of these different things, and then they come together and they kind of hash it out and they manage to find ways to live with themselves, and that's the thing that something like August cannot really capture. So I find this quite interesting because I see this language of the computer doesn't take bribes really, that you don't find a whole lot of it, either in Soviet sources or talking to these engineers. Like I did a bunch of interviews with these 85-year-old men and women, some of them were women, who are involved in these things, and it doesn't really come up when you talk to them, but it really comes up when you talk to the 40-somethings who work with them in the 1990s, and in particular those who think of this, who think of digitization not so much as an engineering problem, but as a political problem. And there, becomes really important to say, what is it about post-Soviet Estonia that makes it different from the Soviet period, particularly because, and I think the same is true for Ukraine, so many people are the same, right? So if the prime minister is the same guy who was the head of the Council of Ministers or the minister of this and that in the late Soviet period, how is this any different? Like, what exactly has changed? And that's a kind of a question of political rhetoric that's really kind of hard to figure out. And so this language of, well, the Soviet period is represented by corruption and handshake deals and blats and all of this stuff. And because we use computers, it doesn't matter that it's the same people in power, because the computers can check them. Computers can create transparency. That's a really powerful argument. And that dovetails nicely into this neoliberal information age moment where computers become this techno-utopian tool of achieving efficiency in all kinds of industries by cutting waste, as opposed to actually restructuring economic systems, right? As opposed to actually doing public investment, for instance. So it's this like neat little moment in the 1990s where these two rhetorics overlap. And I think that partly also explains why, for instance, the European Union is so eager to fund these digital development projects, because they really do speak the same language. And then to quickly address this thing about telling the story without going through Moscow, this is maybe a disappointment in the book. I do have to go through Moscow on a couple of occasions, but I do address this directly. Because I think that thinking about the borderland, particularly when it comes to high-tech expertise, is super important, and in a lot of ways a product of deliberate Soviet policy. In somewhat different ways that this plays out in Ukraine versus the Baltic, but certainly in the Baltic, one of the reasons why not just Estonia, but also Lithuania, for instance, developed this like huge amount of, but Estonia in particular, develops this huge amount of expertise in various high-tech fields, is because the Soviet Union deliberately accords privileges to these high-tech institutions like the Institute of Cybernetics, so that they can go to Scandinavia, which is neutral, by and large neutral in the Cold War, right? So Finland is pro-Soviet and Sweden is neutral. And make connections there and basically steal know-how and bring it back to the Soviet Union. So that's kind of the logic why, and this is, I think, quite similar actually. The logic is somewhat different, but the overall idea of privileging these areas that are near border zones, that can have these useful cross-border contacts and bring high-tech knowledge, tech transfer back to the Soviet Union, is true for Ukraine, it's true for Armenia and the Caucasus, and a couple of other places. So that's, I think, why and of course these places talk to one another, right? Like they're the places that, any computing engineer wants to talk to another computing engineer, right?
By the way, it's really interesting how it happens. So, whether there are enough research on that, how it actually happened between these contexts.
Yeah.
Do we have questions? We have one question here, another one here. So please.
Thank you so much for the lecture. I was curious whether you could kind of share a little bit on the way you reconstructed this infrastructural histories, entanglements through, for instance, you mentioned that you did interviews, you also used newspaper, some governmental policy documents, so I was wondering whether you could share a little bit more on the ways, like your methods, or where there were any challenges in obtaining access to some of the things, to the interviews, yeah.
Yeah, no, huge challenges, so many challenges. The biggest challenge, but I think also in some ways the most productive challenge, was, so I started this project in 2017. I started it with some interviews that I did in Estonia, and I sort of envisioned this as being a kind of pan-Soviet project where, you know, clearly I would have to say something about Ukraine, but also Armenia had a huge computing industry. A lot of the story, as you mentioned, like Ben Peters does tell it through Moscow, and there, you know, the Novosibirsk Research Institute plays a huge role in this whole thing. And I was about to do my archival research in 2020. So I was going to go to the archives of the Academy of Sciences in Moscow, I was going to go to the National Archives, I was going to go to all kinds of places in 2020. So that didn't happen, or you can imagine why. So then I was, okay, well, it's not going to be a pandemic forever. I might, you know, maybe I won't go in 2020, maybe I even won't go in 2021, but I'll go in 2022. So that didn't happen either. So I had to construct or reconstruct this whole story without access to any of the archives in Russia. And I also, I don't know, people go kind of back and forth on this and have different opinions about the ethics of hiring somebody to do research for you in Russia if you're not able to go yourself. I kind of considered this, but ultimately I thought that this actually provides an opportunity to write a history, as you said, with an absent imperial center, and to really, and by that point I was really thinking about the region and the borderland as a particular analytic tool through which to think through all of this. So in terms of challenges, that was one major challenge. The other one, I think, is just a kind of analytical challenge, which is, you know, in science and technology studies and history of science, we think of, you know, in terms of socio-technical systems, right? Which is a fancy way of saying that any kind of doodad, a computer, you know, X-row, whatever, functions because of its technical components. Like there's engineering that either works or doesn't work, right? Like it's bound by the laws of physics and by expertise and things like that. But then it also works because of the social components around it. So, and these mean, you know, you need to have a framework of legislation that, for instance, says how databases operate. You know, what kind of information is collected, like that sets rules on like how the information is encoded, what standards are used, etc., etc. But then even things like, you know, you need to have a certain amount of expertise in place, and for that you need a history of computing education. So you need something like the Institute of Cybernetics, and why is it there? This has to do with politics, it has to do with culture, it has to do with all of these things. You know, there's all of these bits that need to come into place for this thing to function. And then, but that's so much, man. Like, you need to figure out a way to sketch out the story that captures the technical part of it in enough detail that it makes sense to experts who actually know this stuff, but also to readers who know nothing about computer science. And then you need to capture the social parts of it. So kind of making these choices, you can't tell all of this, so you make choices about, you know, here I want to emphasize this social aspect, here I want to emphasize this technical aspect. So just kind of figuring out how do you make these choices, what exactly is the story that you're trying to tell out of these like million things that need to feed into a particular part of infrastructure. so that the story made sense. That was a huge challenge. I'm not sure if I rose to the level of that challenge, but you know, I gave a stab at it.
Thanks. My question and comment built partially on what Taras just said about this idea of computer being not biased and where the imagination comes from. Because partially my project before the full-scale invasion was related to urban planning expertise, and therefore I tackled the question of automated management system and how it was deployed in one specific city, meaning here in Lviv. And I also thought, I found out many of the questions and comments that Taras just made about like, reduction of the human bias and how I partially can explain it through Weber's ideas on bureaucracy, an idea that you have to make an algorithm which is free from the human subjectivity. Whatever person feels the position, you still have the algorithm. And technology partially answers to this challenge. And another source of inspiration for me comes from Theodore Porter's idea of trusting numbers. And how partially, like all this idea that numbers are not lying, unlike people. And therefore, those two, the bureaucracy and trusting numbers, comes into this argument why we might believe in technology, and especially computer technology, as being pure from human judgments. And my question and comment is also about this scaling and descaling. Because in case of automated management system, an example that you brought with water supply, being possible to use it either for one specific location, like one city, or for one specific industry. In our case, it was also a television industry, and like deploying it for making production more efficient. So and I also thought about like this scaling and descaling also with example of Vilnius, and how you can have this whole system designed for one city and then upscaling it into the whole state. So it's very similar to this Soviet type of logic and this cybernetic, how to have it scaled and descaled, and the possibility for growth, this scaffolding, which is designed within the system itself. But my question, very specific question, because it was a big comment, is rather about these databases and legacies. Because I'm really wondering about the connection of the data on the very ground. Because it's good if you can have a connection between the registers, but what constitutes the core of connection of the data? Those institutions which collect these birth certificates, which collect this tax information. So still you have human being often in the very end of this chain who collects this data. And for me, I see a precise legacy in the way how this data was collected during the state socialism and afterwards. You might have new databases related to market economy, but about human beings, I'm wondering, do we still have the legacy of collecting these databases inherited from the state socialism, or something changed in the very core?
Yeah, so great questions. Let me answer your comments first, because I found them super generative. So the scaling thing, yes, absolutely. That is a huge part of that vision. I think it's important to also remember that it's a total fiction, right? Like the scalability, and anybody who actually like builds these systems is hyper aware that making these things scale is a lot of work, and that's part of what the extra people are up to, right? Like, is they're trying to do this work in Ukraine to actually demonstrate that they can do it. And so, kind of related to that, I think the other part of your comment, you know, where does this trust in numbers come from? Again, I accept the comment. I think it's really on point. There is a lot of this that comes from Wiener. But I think we need to historicize it, because you can read Wiener in a number of different ways. And so there are moments, so part of the book kind of traces the shift in thinking from, like, broadly, let's say, a kind of idea of cybernetics that comes from these automated control systems or automated management systems. It's very kind of industrially focused and really is kind of this engineering mindset of you know, trusting in numbers. But that's that's not the only kind of cybernetics you have in the Soviet Union. You also have cybernetic sociology. And who are these people who are really kind of hyper attentive to local specificity and the fact that you precisely cannot trust in numbers because the numbers require interpretation and they tell you different things in different places, and precisely what the numbers tell you is that this stuff isn't scalable, right? To connect the 2 points that you're making, that what works in Vilnius does not work in Tashkent, right? And one of the interesting things that happens is that, you know, who really likes sociologists? Mikhail Gorbachev. So these folks who've been doing, you know, like Tatiana Zaslavskaya in Novosibirsk, but also Mario Lauristin in Tartu, who've been doing what they call cybernetic sociology since the 1960s, suddenly find themselves with tremendous political authority from like 1985 onwards, right? So, you know, the degree to which your commitment to a kind of algorithmic or cybernetic view of the world leads you to this kind of computer doesn't lie, let's take the human out of the loop kind of model, or to this, oh no, like the world is much more complicated than we thought, is actually historically contingent. So that's kind of response to your comment. And then in terms of like how the data is actually gathered, I mean, that's really, you know, we owe it to state socialism, but state socialism owes it to World War I, right? And you know, there's an argument to be made that it owes it to the British administrative state of the late 19th century, right? But really, World War I think, is the point where these, and that's, you know, is like partly Ted Porter's argument, but definitely John Agar's argument in The Government Machine. So that's the point where, because you have to move millions of people around and then pay them old age pensions afterwards, that you actually have to develop these mechanisms of data collection. And then it is quite remarkable, I think, the way that the logics of data collection and data processing, you know, which is done on paper and you know, using filing cabinets and things like that in World War I, gets propagated to the present, even though the media changes quite considerably, right? But like, you know, even if we look at the terminology that we're using or the aesthetics of it, right? File, right? Like the little file folder icon, right? Like it's the same, like that's what we owe this, this logic to.
2 last questions, 3 last questions. We can collect them.
Yeah, I was gonna say maybe we can collect them.
Yeah, thank you very much. A question about X-source being open source. Could you please tell more about what for software of this scale does it mean to be open source? Is there any information whether it helped in development, maybe Trembita? And is there maybe a community of people who use this open source code in cases of them doing something with it?
I will ask a question very close to the previous one, maybe. The open source software isn't good or bad itself. It is just open source, so everyone can look at the source code, and if there is some weakness, some bug, good person will report it or will fix, but bad guys will use that for their purposes, so it is not that open source is better or worse. With Estonia, the picture is perfectly clear. There is a company, that Cybernetica, responsible for committing into the specific XRO-based repository for the purpose of Estonia system development. But in Ukraine, things are not so clear for me. I don't understand who is such company in Ukraine, because according to the public information, it is a Ministry of Digital Transformation, but the ministry is not a computer company. And we have a story of Diia development where IPM, software company, was involved as volunteers, and I don't think it is actually good, because if you are a volunteer, you are not responsible for anything. Maybe my question is more about the Ukrainian case, because Estonian case is okay and perfectly clear for me. Do you know maybe some details about Trembita development? Who are guys and
I think the last question.
Yeah, I would just maybe carry on a bit in that for the case of the Czech Republic, where you made this like very smooth picture, hopefully bridging from Estonia to Ukraine. But in the case of the Czech Republic, when we look at this, like making databases, social services, like third state, it's actually the separate, at the same time there was this claim that it makes transparent like extinction of the corruption, but in the Czech Republic is the whole like specific sector of corruption, like this databases and making this for the state, and even like very recently, one of the most like shaking events for this current government now is like conflict over creating this like building permission processes and it actually threatened the whole government and made a possible switch to like this populist government, opposition government, and so yeah. So my question is, how actually this happened to be avoided in the case of Estonia, that there was, is it like the question of the scale, that it's simply 1.5 million people being designed for, or is it like, Czech Republic is 10 millions, where this, when we compare this technological and at the same time economical or socio-economical transition, where is the difference? Why in the Czech Republic we didn't have it?
Well, I think that we might also ask is the fact that the people who hired the Institute of Cybernetics to develop the X-Road, the people who built the X-Road, and the CIOs of the banks who were super interested in cooperating in the construction of the X-Roads, does the fact that these were all friends who all came from the same program in the Institute of Cybernetics, is that a beacon of transparency and non-corruption? Right, so the corruption is a claim, right, and it is precisely a claim that that articulates corruption happening at a particular moment. It talks about the kind of corruption that your everyday citizen experiences, right? Which is that, I need a permit to, build something on my house, and the permit doesn't move until I pay off the right person. But in some sense, that is the least important, or, that's like small-time corruption, right? This is like an unpaid civil servant making a buck. But precisely what we should be interested in is this kind of large-scale, who gets a $20 million contract to build this infrastructure, right? That's what we should be interested in. I think that this language of, Trembita or X-Road or whatever creates transparency is a total ruse, it's rhetoric. So the two questions about that are somewhat connected about the open source versus not open source architecture, and then how is this thing actually built under the umbrella of the Ministry of Digital Transformation. So just to be clear, right, Trembita is not open source. Trembita is based on the commercialized version of the software that Cybernetica LLC developed based off of the open source software that their predecessors had developed. But the specific thing that they're selling is proprietary software. So that's not open source. In terms of how this is done, so I mean, I would need a whiteboard and one of these, I would end up looking like the meme guy, who's like connecting a dot to the dot, and then it's like, there are dots all over the place, to give you like a comprehensive overview of how this happens. But just sort of sticking to Trembita, because when it comes to the development of Diia apps and things like that, those are separate developers, and I had to limit my project somewhere. But with Trembita, for instance, that project is divided basically into two aspects. One is the sort of engineering aspect, and then the other part is the political aspect, or the regulatory aspect, right? So you need like a particular regulatory environment for Trembita to work, and that means making legislative changes, passing laws, training civil servants. It's basically, I hate this term, but it's change management, right? And then there's the part where you actually put the architecture together. And you train the engineers who then manage the architecture, and you talk through like what are the components you need, and et cetera, et cetera. So the change management part is done by the e-governance academy. So this is the Estonian consultants. They're the people, they're the people who work with different ministries and sort of chaperone the legislative changes and so on and so forth. And by and large, the way they do it is that they hire folks from Ukraine who have deep knowledge of the public sector and the people who work there, and are also fairly good coders. And they sort of go between Estonia and Ukraine and sort of facilitate this. And then Cybernetica LLC does the actual architecture. And then, there are bits that get outsourced to Ukrainian companies. There's this whole thing around Ukrainian cybersecurity, which uses, Ukrainian encryption apparently is legally mandated to use very specific Soviet-era standards. That at least everybody I talked to basically said, until recently, that was essentially just another form of corruption, or had to go through a particular group of people. So there are parts of this process where you get to farm these off to local developers, and in particular people who have experience with working between different parts of the civil service. So that's kind of the short version of the story. Did I miss anything? I mean, we're at 8:15 already, so.
Thank you for this exciting talk and exciting conversation, engaging conversation afterwards. We are really lucky that you managed to have this talk for us on your way to Ruta conference. So we appreciated that you managed to be here with us, and thank you again for this conversation. Thank you, our audience, for this, and have a. Looking forward for a book.
Our library.
And, eventually we'll be able to get it in our library for sure.
Yeah, it'll be a year, but you know what the pace of this is, but it'll be there.
But you're still on the last stages of it, so
it's submitted to the press, so.
Great. Thank you again.